What's up, BookTube? It's Leah Cooper here, and today I am bringing you my top 9 favorite reads from 2017. Now, these aren't necessarily books that came out in 2017, though I think I do have a couple of 2017 releases. Basically, this is just the top 9 books that I read in the year. I wanted to do like my reflection on 2017 video, my favorite books and my least favorite books of the year, all pretty much at the end of December, but I just didn't get around to filming anything. So better late than never, right? I really wanted to take this opportunity to reflect on some of the books, the great books and the not so great books that I read. Expect my most disappointing reads of 2017 video to be coming out very soon. I will be filming it later today and hopefully posting it very soon after I post this one. If I have done an individual review of one of the books mentioned here, I will leave a link to it in the cards. I'm also going to try to include links to where you can get most of these books. Why 9 books? Well, originally I was going to do 10 when, I was planning all the videos I wanted to do at the end of the year. And then when I sat down today, I was like, well, you don't have a whole lot of time, so why don't you just do top 5? And so I started making my list, and I realized there were more than 5 that I wanted to talk about, but not quite 10, interestingly enough. So 9, because 9 books really did stand out to me from what I read this year. I've put them in a rough order, like I'm going to work up to my absolute favorites of the year, but I mean, these are all 4 and 5-star reads for me. The order in which I'm going to talk about them is a little nebulous, but approximate, okay? So coming in at number 9 is going to be Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and I do have a full review of Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, so you can check that out. Wildly popular book, wildly popular author. I'm sure a lot of you have read this trilogy, or this duology, and I'm sure a lot of you have read the trilogy. I'm not a huge fan of the Grisha trilogy, and I will say that I am so glad that I read Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom first. Technically, they take place in the Grisha universe after the events of the original trilogy, but generally speaking, you can read either the duology or the trilogy first. I highly recommend reading the duology first because I think overall it's much better written. It shows Leigh Bardugo's strengths in writing really interesting characters, and it's a lot less cliched. Like, the Grisha trilogy was just so cliched and so unenjoyable in so many ways, especially the protagonist I found just dreadful. Whereas all of the characters in Six of Crows, and there are 6 main protagonists, and eventually we do get all 6 of their points of view, they are all so interesting and faceted. Not always good people. Many of them are morally gray. Many of them make questionable decisions. But they all have such interesting backstories and motivations. And the decisions that they make in the course of the duology all make sense once we lay down where they come from and their points of view and everything. It just... Bardugo really excelled at creating consistent characters that are just really interesting, and I found myself just really invested in them and their stories, and I look back on that trilogy fondly as maybe something I'd want to pick up and read again, just like if I had a weekend and I just wanted something easy to read, fun, good, adventurous fantasy. Number 8 is going to be a short story, and that is The Ruin of Gabriel Ashley by KJ Charles. This is technically a prequel to her Society of Gentlemen trilogy, though I wouldn't read it unless you've read the first book in that trilogy, which is called A Fashionable Indulgence. But in general, the entire Society of Gentlemen trilogy is really fantastic, and I highly recommend it as some of Charles's really excellent, purely historical romance writing on display. But this short story really just, it's short, it's hot, it's funny, it sucks you in. You have to read it if you pick up the trilogy. Number 7 is going to be Fox Gambit by Yoon-Ha Lee. Again, I have a full review of this book as well as the sequel. I will leave links to up above. It's a science fiction. It is a hard science fiction, going to be a trilogy. I think the 3rd book is coming out later in 2018, and I'm super excited for it. This book, though, this first book, Fox Gambit, is not an easy book to read. If you're not familiar with science fiction, I wouldn't start here, to be perfectly frank. It's mind-boggling. In my review, I compared it to a YouTube video called What English Sounds Like to Non-Native Speakers. And in many ways, reading Fox Gambit felt like watching that video. Similar concept, as though I was reading something written in English, but so much of it wasn't precisely in English that I understood, because it's so immersed in the reality that it's taking place in, and in the far-flung galactic empire that it's set in. And there isn't a whole lot of actual exposition given. There's just not time dedicated to that. And that's one of the things I love about it. It really just throws you into a story about an extremely rigid, militarized, dictatorial regime that's trying to hold on to every corner of its empire, and a military commander who is put in a very unique position to carry out her orders. It's a fantastic story. The sequel was surprising, and I want to see where Lee takes the third book. But if you are a veteran science fiction reader, or if you're comfortable with science fiction in general, I would highly suggest checking this book out, because it's so good. And if you're a big fan of being thrown in the deep end, if you enjoy the brain challenge of piecing together a very alien reality, then I think this book is great. I like that. I enjoy that. I don't like having an author painstakingly just talk down to me, basically, which I find is the reality with a lot of exposition heavy passages in books. I like teasing out what everything is and what it means, and having the freedom to imagine what's being conveyed to me. And so I can't recommend Fox Gambit highly enough. Coming in at number 6 is actually going to be a trilogy of books, and that is the Captive Prince Trilogy by C.S. Picot. Again, I have a full review for this trilogy. I will leave a link to it. And actually, can you sense a theme with like my favorite books tend to be ones that I actually took the time to write full reviews for? Go figure. But I love the Captive Prince Trilogy. Again, this is an fantasy trilogy, and I mentioned the trilogy in particular, and I'm going to put emphasis on that, because I think while each book is a standalone book, you really need to read the whole thing. Like, that's just it. Because I think the first book gets kind of a bad rap for being like a slavery romance story, when it's not. There's no romance in the first book. And there are slavery systems in this world. There are multiple kingdoms, and there are different slavery and indentured servitude systems in the different cultures. And we're given a very limited perspective on what is an alien culture to the POV character. And, he has a very limited scope of both what he understands about his situation and the people around him. And so you really need to read the whole thing so that you understand all of the different angles that are going on. There's a lot of political machinations. There are some really great battle scenes. There's an intensely emotional romantic relationship in the latter books. And it's just, it's so good. And it's so satisfying to get to the end of it. I can't recommend it enough. Number 5 is going to be Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Again, I have a full review of this book. I will leave a link to it. I loved it. This book, I think, teeters on the edge between YA and adult fantasy. There is some minor adult content. It's very brief, and it's not very graphic, and that's why it kind of pushes it into the adult category. I mean, technically, I think I would categorize this, if I could, as like new adult fantasy, but that isn't technically a genre that really exists. This takes place in a world where there is a kingdom, and our protagonist is from a small village very near the forest. We know that there's something evil about the forest. If you go into it, you tend to come back out of it either changed or you don't come out of it at all. There's a tower in which a wizard named the Dragon lives, and every 10 years he takes a girl from the village, or one of the surrounding villages, and no one hears from her for 10 years, and when she comes out of the tower, she leaves. She goes off. She doesn't stay with the village. And so everyone has a lot of ideas about what must go on in the tower, but the wizard protects them from the evils of the forest. And so they go along with the arrangement. And our protagonist is not supposed to be selected, but then something is discovered about the protagonist that means she has to be the next girl selected. And I love this book. It is so... I loved it. I consumed it in about 2 days. I couldn't put it down. I actually went out and bought myself my own personal copy because I knew I would want to reread it. The dragon is such a cranky old man, and he's terrible to everyone. I love cranky characters like that. Agnieszka, our protagonist, is such a... Oh, she's just not going to take any of his shit. And I love her interactions with him. Like, even though the dragon is wise and powerful and trying to teach her stuff, Agnieszka really doesn't put up with any of his bullshit. She's a very, like, in charge of her own situation, even when she doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of information or knowledge. And she does make mistakes, and she does realize that sometimes she has a very naive perspective, and that doesn't always serve her well. That is something she has to learn. And I love the magic in the book. A lot of people criticize this book for having too vague a magic system, and I call that a result of the Brandon Sanderson effect. Brandon Sanderson, famously taught creative writing at a college I can't remember the name of, and those videos are online, and a lot of people like to reference them, wherein he talks about when you write fantasy, you have to create rules for your fantasy, and everything has to, basically work like a machine or like science, and everything has to make sense, and you have to have constraints, and you have etc. etc. And it's also calculated, and so it's also frankly boring in my opinion. Like, there's something beautiful and nebulous about the magic in Uprooted that I adore, and it's beautiful. And the characters are great. Number 4 is going to be Peter Darling by Austin Chant. I actually don't have a full review of this. And it's probably a shame that I don't, because this is such a beautiful, not too long. It's kind of a shorter novel by an independent press. So I will leave a link to the publisher's website down below in case you're interested in buying it, buy direct, etc. If you can tell from the title, Peter Darling is a sequel to Peter Pan, and it's a trans riff on that story, wherein Wendy and Peter are the same person, is actually a trans man stuck in a society and a time when that concept is not well understood or even really well defined, and kind of overwhelmed by the crushing expectations and pressure of being AFAB. Peter runs away to Neverland again, where he can be himself. And it does have a romance with Captain Hook, and it deals so much with Peter's pent up, kind of rage and internalized anger and frustrations. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I was on the edge of my seat throughout the entire thing reading it, and my heart just aches for Peter and James Hook in it. And it also has just some of like the hottest kissing scenes in a book I have read this year. Like, just hair curling, so good. Can't recommend it enough. Own voices as well. Definitely check that out. Number 3 is going to be Radiance by Catherine M. Valente. Again, I have a full review of this book. Radiance is A science fiction novel crosses over into a few other genres. Technically, I would call it decopunk, which is similar to steampunk, but calls upon a fantastical version of the Art Deco early 20th century, like very, very early 20th century. It takes place in an alternative reality where space travel was achieved sometime maybe in the Victorian era. We've colonized all of the planets in the solar system. But it's not about that. It's not about the science of living in this alternate reality. It's actually about the disappearance of a documentary filmmaker and her father, who was also a filmmaker, his struggle to tell her life story and the mystery of surrounding her disappearance. The structure of the narrative is non-linear and experimental. There are pieces of the book that are written as traditional prose. There are film scripts, there are advertisement scripts, transcripts of interviews, transcripts of notes, like from meetings between her father and his head writer as they're discussing how to write the script for the film that would tell his daughter's life. There are news articles dating back from the documentary, her childhood, talking about her father, talking about the women who were her stepmothers, all this sorts of stuff. And so it takes a long time as the reader to start to piece together the disparate elements of information to get this whole view of what's happening and what the story really is. But again, like I mentioned with 9 Fox Gambit, I love that. I love the mental gymnastics of piecing together a story and watching it unfold, watching it unravel, even having to jot the odd note down to myself. I enjoy that. And Radiance is kind of the epitome of that. It's gorgeously written. There is basically a mystery, what happened to Severin Unk, but Valente does so many other things in the course of the book. She explores genre and how stories are told and how genre shapes the way stories are told and the way we frame different narratives. If you like stories about storytelling, you have to check this book out. Number 2 could be the whole trilogy, but I'm going to specifically talk about one book in the trilogy, and that is The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is part of the Broken Earth trilogy, which I have a full review of the trilogy as a whole. I loved the trilogy. Don't get me wrong. I gave the first 2 books solid 4 stars, but The Stone Sky blew me away. I mean, I really did like the first 2 books, but like The Stone Sky, I felt elevated the trilogy to like a whole new level of fantastic. It's a difficult trilogy to get into. Technically it's fantasy, and I get why it's technically fantasy. There is magic in it. But to me it feels like a science fiction trilogy with fantastical elements. But maybe that's just me. It takes place at the end of the world. And it's an Earth very different from our own. Every couple of generations there is a cataclysmic seismic event that radically changes the environment. And so the cultures, the human society that has eked out survival in this extremely volatile landscape is very different from the one that we know. There is a subclass of humans called Origines who have the ability to control the earth, and they are basically enslaved, totally subjugated by the ruling class of people. Their lives are extremely controlled, and they're just used for their power and feared and often killed by normal people. Our protagonist is an Origine who has been living in secret in this small village and kind of suppressing her power and hiding her identity. When this huge season kicks off, one of her children is killed by her husband, the other child is taken, and he flees the village, and she pursues him to try to reclaim her daughter. And in amongst this, we get all these different seemingly alternative perspectives giving us pieces of information about, you know, origins and the culture that they exist in and all this sorts of stuff. And we get second perspective, we get first person perspective, we get third person perspective. We seem to be, you know, jumping back and forth in time. And it isn't really until the end that the full picture, the full scope of the story N.K. Jemisin is telling us comes into focus. And that reveal over the course of the third book is so mind-blowing, so satisfying, that even though I will admit I struggled initially to get into the book and to grasp why she was writing in second person and in third person and in first person and jumping around the way that she was. But when I did grasp that, it was so... oh, it was earth-shattering, if I can say that when talking about the Broken Earth trilogy. Anyways, if you like fantasy, if you like science fiction, if you like social commentary in your science fiction, if you want a book that's if you want a trilogy that's thought-provoking and extremely relevant, even though it is fantasy, you really need to check this book out. And coming in at number 1 is going to be The Secret Casebook of Simon Feximel by K.J. Charles. I read a ton of K.J. Charles this year. I loved all of it. Obviously, one of her short stories appears earlier in this list, but I wanted to put one of her full-length novels, and I had to put The Secret Casebook because it stole a piece of my heart, and it never let it go. This book is a pretty unpresuming series of vignettes, written in a similar style as, like, Sherlock Holmes, but it features a cult detective, you could call him, named Simon Feximel, and his kind of biographer slash lover. And The Secret Casebook is written to be a companion to all of these stories that his biographer has written over the years, but this time he's going to tell the tale of their love, and it takes place at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, going through about the First World War. It's so good. I cried my eyes out. It has the perfect kind of nebulous happy ending, if you can call it that. I adore it. I don't have a full review of it, but I can't recommend it enough. In general, I can't recommend K.J. Charles enough. I love her books. If you're looking for MM romance or just historical MM stories in general, you really need to check out K.J. Charles. So this video kind of went on forever. I didn't mean to go into quite so much detail about each of these books, but you know what? It's a wrap up, and these are my favorite books of the year. So of course I'm going to talk about them. Who am I kidding? I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it has provided you with some recommendations for books to pick up in the near future. If you enjoy any of my content and book recommendations, don't forget to hit that like button, and I'll see you guys in my least favorite books of 2017. That'll be coming up pretty shortly. Thanks for watching. See you later.